Nope. And I'm going to welcome Alyssa Rosemartin, our expert from the National Phenology Network. She's an ecologist and environmentalist, a fantastic person all around. And welcome to Talking Data Equity.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really pleased to be here and excited to sort of start and foster and connect more in this community, especially in terms of how data equity applies to natural science. So yeah, I'll just do like a little background about who I am, and then a couple of examples where I see the relevance of the data equity framework in my work. So I grew up outside of Philadelphia, like middle class, white. My dad immigrated from England, and my mom's a Long Islander with German roots. And I was basically always outside as a kid, running down the stream, turning over rotten logs, and definitely in the spring and summer, a ton, and less in the winter. I was really realizing how much I spent time indoors in the winter. And it's only now, I live outside of Boston now, and I hike every day. And I'm like realizing how amazing and changeable and dynamic winter is too. I guess I also will mention that I've sort of always had a split between humanities and sciences. In college, I majored in Latin American literature and environmental science. And then I worked in Nicaragua in the Peace Corps, like in the environment sector after college. And then I got my master's in wildlife conservation and management at the University of Arizona, studying these birds that nest on sandbars in the Gulf of California. And then now I've worked at the National Phenology Network for over 10 years. And as Heather said, our mission is to better understand the seasons, essentially. And we do that primarily through a big data collection, citizen science, volunteer science data collection project called Nature's Notebook. And one of the products we have is this map of the status of spring. And so I've been thinking, I think the data equity framework piece on whose definition is centered really comes to mind when I'll share that in the chat. But so this is one of these products that we make. It's this map of spring arrival, and it's based on lilac and honeysuckle leaf out and bloom in the spring. And there's ties to like atmospheric science, like that does seem to really be when a shift in winter weather patterns change to spring weather patterns. But it is also sort of arbitrary, or, in a particular cultural context, that lilac and honeysuckle bloom matter. So I think just thinking about how we all see and experience spring and what stands out to us, and like, what would it look like if we had, 50 or 100 maps of the start of spring that had meaning to different people in different places. So like a normal day for me, I work from home. I work in Massachusetts for the University of Arizona. I get up, I go for a hike in the woods. And that's something I've done over the last like 3 years, because I don't want to become this desktop ecologist where like the only way I understand nature is through like models and data. I just really want to be like grounded and see it. And then I work, I have like this work-life balance. I do like 30 hours a week. So then I work maybe like on a grant proposal focused on climate adaptation in national parks. Then maybe I'm like writing some R code to create a prototype for a new product or visualization. Like, for example, lately we've been trying to figure out how to calculate peak bloom. So this would be like the day or days that the most milkweeds in Oklahoma were in bloom, supporting monarch butterflies on migration. And then maybe most days have a meeting. So maybe like I'm meeting with collaborators on a funded proposal to create a new forecast for an insect pest to help forest managers time their actions to better, to avoid the spread of the insect. So I do kind of a mix of like people, partnership, proposal, and data stuff. So I think the humanities split is probably like the reason why I like really took to this, like we all have a worldview. I think in natural sciences, there's this idea that you learn these tools, you learn the scientific method, and now you're objective. Like now you can find out the truth, and you're like sort of better than everyone else. Like everyone else doesn't really know the truth, but you have the objective tools and you can figure it out. And that maybe always sat wrong, but then like, especially after I started engaging with Indigenous communities and realizing like really what that helped me see what my worldview was, and you know, how I brought different things to particular questions and problems. And I also, you know, thanking teachers, I think back to my high school English teacher, Dave Leshin, who introduced us to critical lenses. And so we had to we read a novel, and then we had to do an analysis through a feminist lens, and then we had to do an analysis through a Marxist lens. And you really saw how the story, like the elements of the story seemed to rearrange themselves based on what lens you looked at them through, and what you prioritized. And so when I started through the Rising Voices, I was gonna stick that link in the chat too. This is an amazing group that sort of re-educated me. It brings together Western scientists and tribes, indigenous communities from across the US, and some Canadian and Mexican, Central American indigenous groups as well, together with this framework of equity and not engaging in the same sort of exploitative, extractive, Western science comes and takes from indigenous communities, but really focusing on what work is going to benefit indigenous communities, how do we collaborate together to come up with climate change solutions. So it's focused on climate change and bringing Western and indigenous science together. So through that group, I really, one huge example is how you think about a plant. So if I'm going out there as a Western trained academic scientist, I would think of like a maple tree as the subject of my study. I'm the person and the tree is the subject. But in many indigenous worldviews, ways of thinking, the plant is a relative, is a relation. It's you're in a mutual relationship of care, and even an elder, right? So the power relationship is reversed, where you're the humble, newly evolved, still working it out being, and the tree is the elder, wiser, longer on the earth being. And I think it just really, it sort of changes everything about how you might ask questions, how you might, just the way that you would approach the whole project. And so ultimately, and then of course there's lots of issues around data sharing and data sovereignty. So if a tribal college student is collecting data on wild strawberries, and that's just kind of getting extracted and abstracted into a data product that we're making, that's sort of the wrong flow of information. So our collaborations with indigenous communities have really become about trust, relationships, talking through all of these issues. And then a lot of what I've done, the most useful things I think I have done is wrangled funding to get indigenous speakers at different forums, and reminding people and pointing people back to all of the great, amazing Native scholars that in these communities. So I've been feeling for a while the field's not objective, but we don't recognize it, we don't talk about it. And so I was super excited to find We All Count's work and take the foundations course recently. And I do feel a lot of it can be transferred to natural sciences. And I think I said that already, looking for collaborators and to kind of join together in this work. So a couple specific examples, kind of continuing on the trend of thinking with indigenous partnerships. There's, we picture this study on huckleberries in Montana, Idaho. A Western scientist wants to know if warming temperatures with climate change is changing the timing of huckleberry fruit ripening. Are they ripening earlier? So they might use a standard protocol, same for all places. The huckleberry is the subject of the study. And the way that our program's set up and that lots of Western scientists use, it's just this simple set of questions do you see ripe fruit? And then you answer yes or no. You put in the date, you put in the coordinates, you've got your little record there. It's totally standardized and complete. But we have collaborators with the Nimipu, or Nez Perce, also known, tribe, who want to understand climate impacts on huckleberry harvest. And we've been collaborating, talking, thinking through things for years. And what they're doing now, they've decided to center the gatherer's point of view in their huckleberry project. And I've just heard a little bit about this effort. I'm not an expert to speak to it, but what they have shared is that it has to do with treating the huckleberry plant as a relative, asking permission to observe, and then they note the timing of fruit ripening, but lots of other things as well, like the condition of the fruit, the color, the juiciness, the taste, the texture, as well as the health of the plant, as well as the whole context. So like changes in nearby stream flow, what is other vegetation doing, what are the animals doing? So the plant is not seen as like alone. When I look back to what the Western record looks like, it's like very isolated. It's like it's just the date that the fruit ripened on this plant at this location, and the Nimipu approach is much like more complete. It doesn't try to isolate the huckleberry as a separate element. And so that, you know, I don't know how much they will ultimately, like they'll share whatever's appropriate to share outside of the community. Salud. But they will, they'll come up with, I mean, the approach is different, the data is different, you know, it's gonna look different, and it's gonna answer their question, right? Which is, what are climate impacts on the huckleberry fruit from like a using it and eating it point of view, and a holistic point of view. Should I do one more example? Okay. So I mentioned we have this big citizen science program, Nature's Notebook, where people go out in their backyards or parks and observe maybe like a maple tree when it flowers in the spring, when leaves change color in the fall. And we have lots of programs at nature centers and arboreta where teams of non-scientists are working together, observing lots of plants and animals. And I changed some of these details, but you could imagine a scenario where there's like a really active program, the volunteers are putting in all these hours, and they're really interested in why these 3 particular blueberry bushes were putting on leaves at different times. But the researchers see that as too small scale a question. It's just like, what are 3 bushes doing? And it wouldn't be publishable. So instead, the data are aggregated across the whole state in a publication where the researchers are the authors, right? And they drive the questions, and maybe they show that leaf out in blueberry has gotten earlier by so many days over the past 10 years. So the data is getting used, but not answering the questions that the observers have. So I have been picturing like a pilot project where we take the first step of the data equity framework, the funding diagram, and use it to like just lay bare, like how's the money flowing, how's the influence flowing, and how's the data flowing in this project, and where do we have leverage points to influence how that's working, how we could remedy or balance it. So I think, yeah, so I don't know, those are some thoughts that I have along the lines of how data equity applies to problems that we face in understanding plant response to climate.
Thank you so much. It's just so exciting for me to hear your experiences of applying data equity, the ideas and the impulses to this kind of science, to this, because it's so true that there's no discipline or sector of science that is immune to having values centered in the data and having values centered in the data storytelling and access to the findings and stuff. And you've just hit on so many of the cool ideas. I just want to clarify, because of course, I immediately think, oh, we should do that. When you were saying you wanted to make a funding web for the project, were you talking about making a funding web for the Nature's Notebook project, like the Citizen Science project? I think you're muted.
Yes. Both. So I think at the national level, like the office that I'm in, I think we absolutely should do it for the Nature's Notebook project. But then we also have what we call local phenology projects. So that's like here in Boston, the Arnold Arboretum has this tree spotters program where they're like there's a group of like 30 volunteers that have organized themselves to monitor these trees. And so I think it would also be effective at that scale, because that's often where the yeah, I don't know. It somehow seems like it'll be more concrete because there's like a specific question is asked, the data are used in a particular way, and the observers, like there's a particular question, there's a particular set of trees and a particular question that the observers have.
Yeah. That's great. We should definitely do that. That sounds really exciting to me. And in kind of the world, I haven't spent very much time in the world of phenology, except for the wonderful meetings I've gotten to have with you. And so kind of in this world, in this part of science, are there conventions or kind of explicit agreements about who gets to own this data?
Yeah. So we think of ourselves as very, well, we have, our data policy is that the data are always like owned in perpetuity by the person who contributed them, but they grant this like free, complete reuse and modification license with it. Like that's what our terms of use says about people's participation. But there's lots of other citizen science programs that do it differently, where the data becomes owned by the program, or where there's less ceding of control over the ownership of the data. Like we do ask everyone to cede like complete control over the data, even though it continues to be theirs. What was I going to say about that? And that in the world that I grew up in, like the academic world, there's a lot of unshared data. Like a normal ecology PI would just like have their grad students maybe collect like 50 years of data on a squirrel, and then on a species of squirrel, and then that would just be in their Excel files, and it would so we feel kind of progressive because we have like public open shared data. But I also think there's lots to think about in terms of who's providing value by creating that data set.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So if I wanted to go and like look at the data that it really just caught my imagination, the two different datas about the huckleberries, like the kind of conventional academic, and like there's one line, huckleberry is this color or whatever. I don't know how you measure the ripeness, but I assume it's color. And then another kind of a whole indigenous approach to collecting that data. Is that data available anywhere that we could look at it?
Yeah, the indigenous side, it is not. I think, but there probably are other examples where, I could probably find an example where someone has shared. That project is sort of still new, and I know that there's very much protection over the location of the huckleberry patches. Like they.
Oh, right. Of course. Actually. So that's, again, because I don't really have that much content experience, of course. So it is very much, there's privacy for huckleberries, just like there's privacy for people. That is so cool.
Yeah.
Here's a question. We're starting to get questions in the chat, and I should have said explicitly, I'm so interested in this because I'm learning so much here from Alyssa. Feel free to put your questions into the chat, or if you want to ask a question, you can raise up your hand and we'll call on you. But there's a really, really important question here in the chat from Stephanie, which says, have you ever worked on a project where the research team was not inclusive as they could be? I think, have you ever worked on a project where the research did that lead to not asking the right questions, and how did you handle that? And do you have any practical advice on any of us helping getting the right people at the seats?
Yes. Yeah, so I do think, I certainly, yes, this is super common, right? To be on a research team that's not as inclusive as it could be or as we want it to be. And I think a lot of times there's kind of an inertia. So you invite the people to the table that you've collaborated with before, or that you already know, or that you met in this way. So I think more seats at the table. So I think it's also, I guess, one project I feel fairly good about, but still it was complicated. But it was about forest pests in the Northeast, and the three of us that were got the money, really thought about like, who are we going to invite to be part of this, and like make sure that we represent like career stage and as much like racial diversity as we could. But again, we were like limited by, I don't feel great about it, right? Like we were limited by our own networks, and we're limited by like who is already working on forest, you know, like who are the state forest managers for these different states. But then when we got in the room, I think acknowledging, gosh, how did we try to do it? Just bringing up the fact that there are power relationships at play, and the people who are going to be wanting to publish are going to like want to see it in one way, and the people who are going to want to just go back to work and have an efficient day managing the pest, and they don't care as much about the publication because they're not incentivized by it. So we tried to be explicit about what people's different incentives were, and even the early career versus the late career, you know, like the early career people are more incentivized than the late career people. So I think trying to make that explicit and having outcomes from the work that met everybody's, but it just feels like that's also very much a job of like conscious facilitation when you're in the room to like track if the group is drifting towards the priorities of a more empowered group or drifting towards the priorities of a less empowered group. And so I think it's definitely like a work in progress. I'm trying to think if there's like guidance that I've looked to on that. And I'd love to hear if there's resources that others know about.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And it is really challenging to kind of not just let priorities drift towards, you know, certain groups of people. And I have two questions. One of them is mine, and one of them is coming from the chat. They're really closely connected. And one of the things that has like, what's really interesting is that you work in a field where there's this thing called citizen scientists. And that doesn't exist in every field, right? Some fields are very, very against that idea, but I know that there's been a lot of encouragement of citizen science, especially around the earth and natural science. And so the question from the chat is, how do you provide credit to the individuals that can contribute to your projects? And are the citizen scientists satisfied with that type of credit? Do you think that there's better ways? Do we need to come up with better ways?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way there's like thousands of people that contribute data every year. And it is actually quite tricky technically, but I think this is, you know, something we should be seriously thinking about, to track through like whether so-and-so's actual observation got used in a particular paper. So it's just a blanket acknowledgement that we ask for, like this paper benefited from the many observers who participate in the Nature's Notebook program. But there is, is I gonna say, we haven't heard dissatisfaction about it, but it's also like we haven't asked. So, you know, I think we have further to go there for sure. And the thing that seems to mean the most to folks is when we do one every year at least, but then we also do smaller where we find papers that use their data, and we like have a little workshop conversation where we like talk about, this was how the data got used, and thank you, and this is what your work makes possible.
Okay.
You try to do that as much as possible, and like other, and we have these, and there's also a privacy thing too, right? So like, I think our default assumption was that people, and it's to this day, they're identified as observer IDs. It's not people's names, and except on the leaderboard where it's like first name at state is how they get, you know, kind of credit on the leaderboard. But I think there's like all those things to think about. Like maybe privacy is, we sort of assumed maybe that privacy was more important than credit, but maybe credit's more important than privacy. And so we have to evaluate that.
That's cool. Oh, I didn't know there's a leaderboard. That seems cool too. Is it possible? I think this is kind of getting back to the previous question about representation on the team. Is it possible to become like a formal scientist, like not a citizen scientist, but a formal scientist, without having to kind of comply with all the formal kind of European ways of knowing? Like, could you be an accredited Indigenous ecologist? Or is that person definitely going to be called a citizen scientist in the lens of kind of Western academia?
Yeah, so I think that I don't apply the citizen science, and I didn't say that more clearly at the beginning, but I don't think of our Indigenous collaborators as citizen scientists, because they're typically not like collecting data in Nature's Notebook in the same way. And so when they are, that's maybe just like one role that they're undertaking. But I think, I mean, I guess your question for me gets like really philosophical about the meaning of the word scientist. Like, there are people who, what they're doing is science. I would call them a scientist, but they're not, they're like another, they might consider themselves an Indigenous knowledge holder.
Right.
So, and then I don't know who they would be accredited by, right? Like, the whole system works differently. Like, it would be if you had trained for a long time and your elders said that you were good, your knowledge was solid, that you could be out there sharing what you know, that is often how it works.
Right.
But yeah, like, would it be so radical for us to call the volunteer participants in our program scientists rather than citizen scientists? Like, they're participating in the scientific endeavor, and in some cases, they are asking and answering the questions. So
yeah. It is an important kind of philosophical question. We have a really technical question, which I really love, a very practical question. What tools do you use for sharing data analysis? Are you on GitHub? Are the nature notebooks on GitHub? For people who aren't familiar with GitHub, GitHub is kind of it likes to call itself a social network for code, which isn't a terrible description. Like, different people have kind of profiles on this website called GitHub, and you could store code or data or analysis there, and you can make it private or you can make it public. So if you don't know what GitHub is, that's a very fast description of GitHub. But so how are you sharing?
So we do have a GitHub for the organization at USAMPN, and then we have an RNPN. A lot of ecologists use the program R, and so we have this RNPN library where you can directly, it's basically like a wrapper for our API, so you can get data out of the database directly, and do, like, it has functions for some of the like more common analyses. And I'm now the maintainer of that RNPN library, so I'm like on a learning curve about that, but I have been thinking about the equity intersection there, and we make these little code vignettes, like, that are like to walk people through how to do common tasks. And like, what are the assumptions that I'm making in those, when I say, like, clean it in this particular way, I'm making assumptions about the data and about the use. And so there's certainly things that come up there. So yeah, GitHub. Oh, and yeah, so we have on our website, you can download everything as a CSV or Excel file. And we have this cool visualization tool where you can do like mapping and graphing, and you can compare, like, the model predicts lilac will bloom on this day. Like, what did people actually say in their place? We do have a bunch of tools for data access.
Awesome. Great question. I'm very, very happy that you asked that question, because I think it's important. And in terms of the reporting, are you reporting primarily in English? Are there like First Nation languages that get reported, or Spanish, or like how is the balance of kind of producing knowledge?
Yeah, we have a handful of resources in Spanish, and we want to do more. And really not much reporting, right? Like, that's a super interesting point, right? That we have sort of like generic, like, this is why you should care about phenology and seasons, and some stuff to help people observe, right? But not so much the, like, this is why it matters, and this is what the data showed, back out stuff. So that's a really important point to think more about and do more about. And then the Indigenous languages, for sure, there's like such a cool project at the College of Menominee Nation. They have this phonology learning path where they actually are using Nature's Notebook because they decided like it wasn't private, like it's a public engagement space. But each sign has the name of the species and the life cycle in the Menominee language, and then in English and Latin as well, I think. And language comes up again and again, like in every community, like that the language is the, in Indigenous communities, like the knowledge is tied into the language. So like knowing the names for things is like really good and important. We have like opened the door and said that if there was interest in having Indigenous languages on our website, we would be thrilled. You know, we would put that on the species profile pages. We would use it however it's wanted, but that they have not said that. It's more like they're using it in their communities and on their websites, which totally makes sense.
Yeah, that's really cool. Okay, there's a number of questions coming in now. We're really, okay. I'm going to try and pick some questions that a lot of people are asking. How much interpretation or narrative do you get into when reporting about things like spring arrival time? So for example, in relation to the climate change, species extinction, who gets to decide what the story is about what that data points to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's another place where the framework is really, really important. And I think we haven't thought so deeply about it yet as much as we should. So we do get to tell some of the story, right? Like we have on our website and in our workshops and stuff, we talk about how climate change is making spring earlier. You know, and then there's a lot, I think there's actually, I don't know if this is where the question's going, but I think there's like a decent amount of variation on our staff, even among like how much we, like sometimes I say, you know, a longer growing season is like one of the only pieces of good news with climate change, right? There are places that are going to be able, I mean, there's still, it's not like perfectly awesome, right? There's still lots of problems, drought, or like a false spring where you plant early and then you get hit by a frost. But if you look like sort of big picture across the US, there are, and probably Canada too, growing, a longer growing season. So I feel like, you know, maybe the risk with that is that people will think like, oh, like climate change is great and there's no problem or whatever. But I also feel like being negative and pessimistic about every single aspect of it is like heartbreaking, right? And like, if we just think about, I don't know, sea level rise, like the people who study sea level rise, like never get to say any good news about it, I don't think. And so trying to balance that. But yeah, in terms of like, who's going to benefit from that longer growing season, and, you know, like all of those judgments implied, and like even there's like climate change winners and losers, right? People talk about that a little bit with different species that are going to do better under climate conditions and other ones that are going to do worse. And there are human values attached to whether we like those species or not, or, you know, there may be, you know, differences among people, you know, who value certain species over others. And so I think there's like a lot more nuance that we could be acknowledging in terms of that, like whose narrative, like, I'm not even remembering all the narrative tools that you present, but like whose perspective is whose protective is centered, and doing a responsible job with that.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I'm going to follow up with this question because I think this question really gets to the core of a lot of things we're talking about here. So we've been talking about a lot of things that might benefit from some changing, like data ownership, the funding web, interpretation. In kind of your field, where does the power to kind of gatekeep those changes lie? So for example, if your organization wanted to do something different, is that possible? Do you live in a flexible research environment, or, you know, like if you were going to add a funding web, do you have to get permission from somebody to do that? Like in kind of the natural science ecology world, who's the gatekeeper there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I came back from the Foundations of Data Equity. So it's a small, close-knit team, right? There's like 8 of us. Like I came back all excited from Foundations of Data Equity. And I was like, we should do this. It was more than just the funding web. I was like, we should do the microscope one about like who's getting to ask the questions. And so it was agreed that the next time we got together for like big picture strategic stuff, we would do that. So I don't know if it'll be like later this summer or in the fall, but I think so like in terms of like what our org does, we have freedom. I think this came up in the foundations class too, like all of us are sort of champions. I'm not there's the director, Teresa, and then me and a couple other people who are maybe more like pushing on the like strategic direction kind of stuff. But like, so it's like about in our world, it's pretty straightforward to like do some of that big picture changing, but like a bigger effort to put, to do more workshops in Spanish or more like returning data back or, like some of these things that might be more time consuming, then it's like, well, we have to find a grant that's gonna like support that explicitly because, the other grant is like from the Forest Service and that just supports, the thing that they asked for. And so that's like kind of a question of the flexibility. And then I think, like what other like academic institutions, I think a lot for me, I think a lot of it is about like norms and priorities and and like the incentive structure to, like what can we do to incentivize academics in the natural sciences to think more about this and incorporate pieces.
Yeah, and so is most of the funding through either governmental or academic channels? Like, is there a lot of like ecology philanthropy money or ecology, people that might have a diversity of incentives?
Yeah. I'm trying to think about not just us, but other programs like ours. We're very much federally funded, but there are federal sources that support this, and like especially now there is a big focus in the Department of Interior on environmental justice, and so it's not like that would be impossible. We do not have any foundation support, but that may be more true for other like partner organizations of ours.
That's really cool. I'm really interested in this funding web thing. I'm actually copying and pasting somebody's comment so they can remain anonymous, but I think this is a comment for everyone here, and I think it's a fantastic comment. I love your commitment to go into nature on a daily basis, to not become a desktop ecologist who only understands the world through data. I am trying to imagine what the daily immersion, what that would look like in my work. This says this person, but it also could be my work. Does anyone else here have thoughts about how to stay grounded in the people and experiences that make up your data? I think this is such an important question because, of course, it seemed very important when you said, I'm trying not to become a desktop ecologist, but it's so easy to become like a desktop social scientist. So this is a question for anybody here who wants to respond in the chat. If you have any practices or experiences or even suggestions that you haven't tried but you'd like to try about how would you take a walk in the forest if the forest was, whatever it is that you collect data on or that you analyze data on? I think that's a really, really important question that I think we should explore more deeply as a community at We All Count, because it would make a huge difference. And the people that I know that do that, that don't analyze data from communities that they haven't spent time in first. I certainly learned that the hard way by, analyzing data from, different countries where I'd never been, and then getting on the ground in that country and literally having to say, you need to throw out all the analysis that I gave you, because all of my assumptions that were baked into the modeling were, completely inappropriate for this context. So I'd love to hear in the chat if anyone else wants to mention that, because I'm going to stick with the image in my mind of Alyssa walking through the forest in the morning. Okay. Oh, cool. As someone who studies sexual and reproductive health and rights and sex ed, I'm always listening to popular culture and young people's conversations in public to hear what the discourse is in their real lives. What a great idea, right? We do actually live in a forest of data on that. That is so cool. As a data analyst doing quantitative research, I advocate for equity-informed qualitative research that is related to whatever topic I'm working on as a way to stay connected with people impacted. That's such a good suggestion. Very great suggestion. When I worked in children's mental health, I was in a removed management position and did a lot of investigations when things went wrong. Yeah. I decided to get my dog certified as a therapy dog and spent 2 evenings a month in the programs with the kids in a positive setting. That is a fantastic example. What a fantastic idea. I work at a food bank and I make sure I visit pantries every so often, not as a staff member, but as somebody there to use the pantry. It helps remind me of how it feels to to ask for help, the accessibility of services, etc. Very, very awesome. Collaborative and ethnographic community walks. I've seen some of this done within K-12 education, where educators will get to know their students by following them through the days. That's a cool idea. Qualitative methods. Yes, lots of mentions of qualitative data is good for this, which is true. I make sure I connect to the community. Taking a community lens is what helps. I work with college access programs in high schools, and COVID has prevented me from actually seeing the students, but I got to go yesterday. Yay! Yes, that's such good news. It's so nice to see people again, isn't it? It helps me refresh my motivation. I'm going to try and go in at least once a month. Not just doing this up front, but engaging with the community throughout the entire process. Absolutely. I really want to emphasize and amplify that. Upfront is important and invaluable. Lots of conventional ways leave it to the end. And so doing it upfront is so helpful. But continuing to do it throughout the process, start as early and do it often, is such a fantastic. Okay, here's one more question. I think we definitely have time for at least one more. I love the idea of letting the observers / data gatherers drive the research questions. We talk a lot about having the data source individuals drive the questions as opposed to the top level researchers. But I think there's actually a lot of merit to having the input come from people in the middle of that chain. What is your experience with having the people who are immediately collecting the data choose what type of data to collect? This is a question that anybody here can answer. I mean, obviously we want to hear from Alyssa, but if you also, just like you were sharing the ways that you kind of take a walk in your data forest, how do you help people in the middle of the data collection chain? I think this is a really important question because it often gets overlooked, especially in countries outside of Canada and the United States. The people who collect the data really are like a whole middle sector of the chain. There are people who are getting their data collected, and then there are kind of people who are setting research questions, analyzing data, and then there's so many people in the middle that their full-time professional job is to collect data. How do we give those people an opportunity to drive research questions?
Yeah, I'm trying to think like what that means in my, so like, yeah, the plants don't collect data on themselves, right? So the data collector I think of as like the furthest away. And I think, I'm trying to think, this is other people on our team work more directly with these programs, but I think there have been questions that have come from like what people have noticed when they're out there, you know, like a new insect or something, and then that leads to a series of questions. But I'm wondering if the middle person in my world would be like the cooperative extension agent who's like managing the program, who sees kind of like both like what the plants are doing and what the people are doing, observing them, and also has like a, you know, has a connection to like what the bigger questions are right now about climate change or something. And so, I think, and in some cases that is definitely happening, like I told a case where there was a mismatch, but there are cases where that program leader has said, like our, what is it? Like, there is an example in a wildlife refuge where they wanted to know, they can release water, they can flood the refuge, and they wanted to know when the cottonwood was dropping seed versus when the invasive plant was dropping seed, so they would spread the native cottonwood faster. Right. So they like asked that question. The data collectors were on board with it for sure, and then that was used in management. So there are cases that I think maybe that's what the question asker is pointing to. Yeah, that can be really powerful.
Yeah, yeah, I think that is a really good example. And I think also when you were talking about the Huckleberry Project, that the people who were closer to the middle, I think, if I understood it correctly, were the people that wanted to collect like the color, the flavor, the stream information. And I think that's really a good example of somebody in the middle getting to kind of drive questions. If we do consider the plant kind of the entity that is giving the data, which is really quite cool to think about. Another question, it came up earlier that I did not get to, is when you were talking about, this person says, I really, really like the image presented about reversing the flow of data. That so much of what we take for granted is, that data is extracted and then fed up to more and more specialized people who are more and more farther removed from kind of the actual grassroots, literally in your case. Do you have any practical tips? Have you seen anything practical work to help reverse the flow of data, like to make data collection less extractive?
Oh, like nothing comes to mind right away. So maybe I'll try to, but it's a great question. Maybe someone else in the community has a on that in any context.
If you're here today and you have ideas, if you've had any experience with kind of reversing the flow of data where data doesn't necessarily get farther and farther away from the data source, but actually stays with the data source. So in the Huckleberry example, I think that you said that there's a group of Indigenous researchers that are collecting their own data and they're retaining that data. Did I understand that correctly?
Yep.
So yeah, I think that might be an example.
Yeah, exactly. And it'll stay in that context, right? Like that's another thing that's very common in Indigenous perspectives is that you can't really abstract and apply and see what's happening to, the huckleberry across the continent. Like what is what's happening there. And so I think that is a way in which it stays.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, or whether, I guess I wonder if this gets at it. There have been some cases where with respect and relationship, a big NOAA product on drought has gotten used as context for an Indigenous climate adaptation plan. So they're really focused on their species and what matters to them, and they're consuming the national drought information from NOAA. So that's maybe a place where it's working better.
Can you remind me what NOAA stands for?
Oh, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Okay, so it's NOAA.
Yep.
Okay. Fabulous. Okay, well, we are all very close to the end of time. So I'm going to give everybody here one last minute to raise their hands. Or ask a question. Here's somebody great with an example of one of the ways that they are reversing the flow of data, and that's through something that they call data validation workshops. where data and findings are worked through with the participants of the study, focus groups, key informant interviews, to see where the researchers are missing perspectives and skewing perspectives. So data validation workshops is a really good suggestion for how to kind of reverse the flow of extraction in the data world. And yeah, I think we'll just end with Alyssa's comment here, which is any other natural scientists out there who want to talk about this more. One of the things we're doing is looking for people who do work in earth sciences and natural scientists in ecology, and you know, forming more ongoing connections around how we can build like a critical mass, how we can move the needle in this particular sector to kind of center equitable practices to make sure that we aren't stuck in the myth of if it's a number, it's value neutral. And that's as true if it's data about a person as if it's data about a huckleberry. And so you can reach out to us. Of course, you can always reach out to me at Heather@WeAllCount if you want to share your information with Alyssa. And you can also find both Alyssa and I on the We All Count forum, which I should put here in the chat, which is actually where Alyssa and I first started talking about what even is spring and how is that a data equity issue. I think we'll leave it at that. So hop into the community if you want to connect with me and Melissa, or you can send me a private email and I will pass your information on. I can't thank you enough, Alyssa. What a perfect start to our spring/summer series, which of course is very culturally specific. And it just is such an exciting event for me to get to talk about this sector of science. And I know we have a couple of other people who did see your name on our Talking Data Equity list and did ask to be included in future Talking Data Equities. And I'll make sure that that you're in the loop. All right. So thank you, Alyssa, and thank you for coming, everyone else. Next week, we have a very interesting guest, kind of from a very different sector, coming from Nairobi, a behavioral economist who is studying violence and the recovery from violence, especially political violence, and how the way that we define the terms when we're researching violence, like things like what does peace mean? What does violence mean? What does collaboration mean? How we define those things really influences what policies get funded and what projects get funded and what governments do. So same time, same Zoom link next Friday if you are interested. And once again, a million thanks to Alyssa.
Thank you all. I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you, Heather.
You're welcome. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. Have a great weekend.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.